So, good evening, guys. And once again, we are back with day 12 of this initiative of Civils Daily called Daily Answer Wars and Daily Answer Wars Prime. So, again, in the morning, we had given you a question related to UPSC main subject GS3, and you are supposed to put the answers in the Telegram group. So, in this session, we'll try to dissect the question or find a basic framework for the answer to the question that was given in the group. And then we will go to checking some of the copies that you have submitted in the group before 2 p.m. So the question was basically a UPSC PYQ, like it was asked in 2022 only from GS3 and from the internal security part. So the question was discuss the types of organized crime, and then we had to describe the linkages between terrorists and organized crime that exist at the national and transnational levels. So this is a topic in GS3, basically linkage between terrorists and organized crime. So it was uh, just lifted from the syllabus and put in the question. So it was quite an expected question, you can say. And you had just 2 or 3 major demands in this question that you had to fulfill in order to get some good marks. Good evening, Varsha. So the basic demands of the question, if we go on to talk about that, are like first you had to just introduce what organized crime is in the introduction. Then you have to talk about some of the types of organized crime. So basically, there are multiple types of organized crime, but if you are able to talk about any 3, 4 of them, I think that is good enough. Next, you have to talk between linkage between terrorists and organized crime that exists at the national and transnational level. So uh, you had just to point out the difference between organized crime and terrorism, and basically how terrorists use organized crime to advance their motives, and then you had to give some examples from both transnational and then national level. So that was the basic demand of this question. We will move forward and see like what all we could have written in this answer. So starting with the introduction, we could have just talked about defined organized crime. So it is described as any group having a corporate structure whose main aim is to obtain money through unlawful activities, often surviving on fear and corruption. These crimes include bribery, counterfeiting, embezzlement of union funds, mail fraud, etc. So basically, organized crime, as the word itself indicates, organized is like something done in a proper way. So you can say that organized crime is also similar. It is just that crime is done in a fixed or proper manner. Like there are institutions in place fixed by the criminals to perpetuate this crime. So basically, some small petty crimes are also included, like bribery, counterfeiting, and then there are some bigger crimes also included in this organized crime network. Next, we come to talking about types of organized crimes. So basically, if we talk in crude terms, you can say that the organized crimes are like of two types. One is traditional and other is non-traditional. So in traditional crimes, you can say that these are some petty crimes, whereas non-traditional are like money laundering, or you can say counterfeiting of money. But here we will just talk about the nature of the crime, so that will be clear itself, like rather than going into talking about traditional and non-traditional and uh, wading into an uncharted territory, you can just go for talking about the crimes. So first and foremost is drug trafficking. So this is a very prominent crime, like all of you must be knowing about that. Every day, every second, third day, we hear news about drugs being seized from some part of India or the other, from ports, from railway stations, from basically transport hubs. So you can talk about that drug trafficking. Of all the illicit products trafficked by organized crime, trafficking is the most infamous, and it has received systematic attention over the last decades. And now, as you can see, that new technological interventions, for example, darknet has come up, and you can also add here cryptocurrency. Like these things enable drug trafficking even more, because now transactions can be made without the knowledge of police, and it has become very difficult to track because of these new technologies and networks such as darknet and crypto coins. Next, we can talk about firearms trafficking. So firearms are trafficked in order to enable these, again, terrorist groups and networks. So you can talk about that firearms are manufactured and traded both legally and illegally, thus making the identification, tracking of illegally manufactured and trafficked firearms complex. For example, you can say that in the border areas, for example, in the northeastern part of India, from Myanmar to India, or from even China to India, firearms are trafficked and supplied to uh, insurgent groups or militant groups, so that they are strengthened, and that makes tackling them even tougher. So we will establish that link when we talk about linkages between organized crime and terrorism, but basically this is one of the organized crimes. Next, you can talk about smuggling. So, smuggling also you must be knowing. Smuggling consists of clandestine operations leading to unrecorded trade. Is another major economic offense. Like without using formal networks, goods and services are exchanged, and that is called basically smuggling. Next, we can talk about money laundering. So, money laundering is proceeds of drug-related crimes are an important source of money laundering. The tainted money is being accumulated and integrated into economy by organized racketeers, smugglers, economic offenders, and anti-social elements. So the crimes from the money from the crimes, like the above mentioned crimes, what they do or the organization do is that they put that money into some other uh, business or syndicate, so that that money can be used in some other manner. For example, where tax havens are there, money is laundered in those parts, so that tax on that money can be saved. And many you must have heard of islands such as uh, Cayman Islands and all Panama Islands, their tax laws are pretty weak, and so money is laundered through those channels. So you can talk about that. Next is narco-terrorism. Narco-terrorism refers to attempts of narcotics traffickers to influence the policies of a government through violence and intimidation, and to hinder the enforcement of anti-drug laws by use of violence. For example, here government is like forced to disobey the anti-drug laws. Like they are narco terrorists. What they do is like they influence the policy of the government through violence and intimidation. Like they kidnap someone or charge ransom and all from the government itself, so that they can force their policies in the government, so that government will have to follow them in order to ensure the safety and uh, well-being of the people involved or the people like extorted and all of that. So you can talk about that. Next is contract killings. So this is basically, you must have heard about it also. Method adopted in contract killings is by engaging a professional gang for a monetary consideration. Here, the professional gang has no like ideological motive or anything like that. They just do it for money, and people just outsource killings to contract killers. Next is kidnapping for ransom. So here again, this is basic petty crimes. For example, uh, people are kidnapped and then ransom is charged from the family, employer, or even in the case of country. For example, you must be remembering about that hijacking of the plane IC-814. So they basically wanted to exchange the release of terrorists by uh, kidnapping hostages. So you can talk about this also. So again, here all of this explanation and all is not necessary, because this is a 10 marker. So just talking about the major crimes, like 4 or 5 of these crimes in a flowchart manner or just in a hub-spoke diagram, and then writing 1 or 2 very small clauses to just define what is drug trafficking, what is firearms trafficking, would have done good for this question. I think you will have then space left for tackling the next part, that is establishing the link between organized crime and terrorism at both transnational and national level. So this part could have been handled in that way. Next, we move on to talking about how terrorists and organized crime is linked at transnational level. So you must be knowing that terrorists are basically, they have a political ideology or they have a political motive to establish a different government or something like that. So they basically, what they do is they use organized crime to prosper their terrorism. Like they use it to fund their terrorism. So therefore, they do this organized crime. So the main motive of terrorism is ideological and political aim, not the acquisition of money. However, money obtained from organized crime aids and abets terrorism, helps in aiding and abetting terrorism. So you can just define this basic link between terrorism and organized crime. Then we move on to talking about how it happens at the transnational level, and then we will talk about how it happens at the national level. So when we talk about transnational level, so first and foremost, terrorism and human trafficking. Here again, all of this explanation that I have given in these points are not necessary. I'll just tell you first of all only. You can just do what one thing is, give some examples and justify this point. So examples will make sure the invigilator, the checker will understand that when once you are writing examples, you understand what is happening, and then he will give you some marks. It is not necessary to write so much of text in every point. Terrorists systematically carry out acts of violence associated with human trafficking to achieve strategic objectives. Abduction, rape, sexual slavery, enslavement, etc., have been used by terrorist groups to subjugate populations and advance their ideologies. So you can talk about this, and most famous 2 or 3 examples. Try when we are talking about transnational organizations, try to give examples from transnational terrorist groups or events that have happened at transnational level, like outside India. When we will talk about national linkages, then you can come to examples from within India or from India's borders and all. So terrorism. So the examples that you can mention here are about Boko Haram and Al Shabaab. So Boko Haram is a terrorist group basically based in Nigeria, Al Shabaab in Somalia, and they have been documented for trafficking children. So you can talk about this. Next is terrorism and drug trafficking. Here, a very famous news was in quite some time for in the news for quite some time in 2013 that Al Qaeda was trafficking drugs to the value of 1.25 billion dollars from West Africa to Europe. So you can talk about that, and I think you should be done with this point. Next, we can talk about terrorism and trafficking in weapons. So some here basically weapons are firearms. So some individuals linked to terrorist offenses are brought up in a criminal environment and retain long-term links and associations with criminal contacts following radicalization. So here you have just to mention an example that you can mention are about Tunisian authorities. So they have seized arms and ammunition catches trafficked from Libya by organized commercial smugglers and financed by terrorist groups linked to Al Qaeda. Next, you can talk about kidnapping and ransom. Here you can give the example of IC 814. Other than that, example from ISIS or Al Qaeda will also do. Next, narco terrorism you can talk about. Here you must be knowing about Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle. So Golden Crescent is basically the area around the northwestern part of India, Afghanistan, which is famous for like uh, drug growing of drugs and all. So you can talk about that Golden Crescent. It is used by Taliban to create instability in India. Next, you can talk about logistic support. So organized crime helps logistical support to terrorist organizations. For example, terrorism in Kashmir is due to uh, logistic support because they get support from the point of logistics, like they are able to move their weapons, they are able to move their personnel, and that happens because they have overground workers in Kashmir. So you can talk about that also. So this is basically the link between uh, organized crime and terrorism at transnational level. So you see that I have just used some of the examples to justify the points, and if you can just mention that, I think that will be sufficient because this is a very like 10 marker question. So you have to be very smart in using your space and word limit while answering this question. Next, when we talk about national level, there are basically 3 4 points that you must be mentioning. One is you must give the example of Northeast India, then you must give the example of Jammu and Kashmir, then you must give the example of Maoist. So these three are very prominent and very famous security threats to India, and there are pretty much certified links between terrorists and organized crime at these levels. So these points should be there in your answer. So when we talk about Northeast India, terrorist organizations in the Northeast mobilize funds by becoming couriers of illegal drugs and arms, and at times even human beings from one point to another within the country. So basically, drugs, firearms, human trafficking, all is happening around the borders of northeastern part of India, especially the Myanmar India border, even Bangladesh India border. So you can talk about that. Next, we can move to Jammu and Kashmir. So funding for terrorist organizations in Jammu and Kashmir are mostly through money laundering, drug money, and counterfeit currency. So this also establishes the link between organized crime and terrorism. Next, we can talk about Western India, that is Maharashtra and Gujarat. So Mumbai, you must be knowing about the D company. There is also a book related to this in the market. So you can mention about that. So Mumbai is the nerve center of India's underworld criminal activity and the crucible of the crime terrorism nexus in the state of Maharashtra. The D company was heavily involved in criminal activities including smuggling, weapons and drug trafficking, extortion, protection rackets, and illegal hawala money transactions. So just giving the example and giving one, two, three uh, keywords, mentioning 2 3 keywords of such crimes and linking it to terrorism will be enough for fetching you good marks. Next, you can move to Maoists. In the Maoist terror movements, their main funding sources come from extortion, running parallel governments, collecting taxes from people in rural areas, and smuggling small arms, homemade explosives, and landmines. So you can again talk about Maoism and give examples of some of the most affected areas. So this was the link between terrorism and organized crime at national level. So these 3 parts were quite necessary for your answer to get some good marks. That is mentioning some of the types of organized crimes, then establishing the link between transnational uh, organized crimes and terrorism, and next national terrorism and organized crime. So these 3 parts were the basic demand of the question and must be written in order to fulfill the demand. Next, you can mention a way forward. So way forward is quite primary. I'll say, like I've just mentioned what we can do, not going into details even one bit. So you can talk about strengthening UN convention against transnational organized crime. So this is a convention and you can talk about that. So just try, ensure that you are not writing in too much detail because that will take a lot of words and space and all. So if you can just use some diagram and all, it will be better, so that your answer will contain all the dimensions also, and the examiner will understand that you have the knowledge. Just due to paucity of space and word limit, you are not able to write a lot of things. Just you are giving an idea, overview of what we can do in order to strengthen our fight against both organized crime and terrorism. Next, you can talk about cooperation between police and Interpol. So, Interpol, you can say, is type of global police, and cooperation between state police and Interpol is quite necessary for controlling terrorism, because these are, as I have established earlier, that there are quite links between transnational crimes and terrorism. So, both these organizations will have to move in a cooperated and coordinated manner in order to tackle this. Now, in some countries, especially in developing and least developed countries, uh, or African countries, you can say, there is very less funds that is allocated for intelligence and purposes like that. So we need to increase that, be it from multilateral investments or be it from national investments. So you can talk about improving the funding for intelligence. So this was the way forward for this answer. Next, in the conclusion, again, just we have tried to be a bit futuristic and summarize the whole answer, you can say. So terrorism and organized crimes are conjoined twins that pose a great threat to the world through their syndicate and their deadly effects. So this is summarizing the above part of above question. And next we talk about a futuristic way forward. That is stringent laws, better intelligence, capacity training of law enforcement agencies at national level and multilateral levels are needed to break this deadly nexus of terrorism and organized crime. So in this manner, we can just conclude this answer. So I hope you got what was to be written in this answer. Just the three parts that I told are the basic demands which must be fulfilled to get good marks. Next, you can just mention a small way forward, or if you don't have space and all, you can just skip this part also. It is not necessary. But if you have some scope or opportunity, you can try mentioning this way forward to get some extra marks. And finally, you just need to write a simple and crisp introduction and conclusion. So that would have been sufficient for this answer. Next, we will try to look at some of the copies and see what you all of you have written and what can be improved further. So first and foremost, we'll move to Varsha's copy. Organized crimes are coordinated across national borders involving groups or markets of individuals who carry out illegal activities for money. So fine, it is good. Types of organized crime: money laundering, human trafficking, money. Okay, I think money laundering you have repeated here also, and here same thing here also. Smuggling of migrants, drug trafficking, in firearms, smuggling of wildlife and cultural property. So good. I think you can just this diagram is pretty good, Varsha. You can just here when you are circling it, no, you can just give a small explanation or give some keywords. Just write the keywords. For example, in drug trafficking, you can give a mention of rising drug trafficking due to new technological innovations. Like you can just mention use of darknet, comma cryptocurrency, and I think that will just add value add to your answer when you are talking about drug trafficking. Just the current and recent problems. For example, you mention, give a bracket and write use of darknet, comma cryptocurrency, bitcoins, etc. When you talk about smuggling of migrants, you can just mention about illegal smuggling. So there was a time where very much there was allegations over some of the terrorist groups that they have smuggled a lot of refugees in European countries. So you can just give the example here, like smuggling of refugees in European countries or developed countries. You can talk about that. So that will make these points stronger. Like the examiner will understand that you have the holistic knowledge, and since there is a limit to what you can write in this answer, you have just used your innovation to like make it better. So otherwise, this diagram is pretty good, and I think that should suffice for addressing this part. Difference between terrorism and organized crime. So I don't think this was required. Difference is they have not asked the difference, so they have asked the linkage basically. So what you can just, for example, the statement I had mentioned to link it, you could have just mentioned that that organized crime, terrorism is not itself done for money. Like it is not something that people do for money or something. They have a political or religious ideology, and for it they use organized crime. So if you can just mention that link, I think that should be sufficient, because they are asking the link between organized crime and terrorism. They are not asking the difference. So I think that will suffice in this answer rather than drawing this table and all. Linkages between organized crime and transnational level, source of financing and logistic support, trafficking of arms. This is not clear, Varsha. I think you must uh, put the PDF in a better way. I think not readable these things. Study natural resources and wildlife. Okay, sites. So basically, these points are good, and what you have written is not quite readable, I guess. So what you can do is, what I'll say is like just mention one example. I think you have mentioned example sites I am seeing here. So in this, I think example is not mentioned. Ethnically or radically motivated terrorism, money laundering activities. Okay, FATF or fine, cyber organized crime activities. So this is fine. Like you have got the concept what needs to be written in this part. Just mention some of the examples, like prominent examples. How drug trafficking. You can just mention a case of drug trafficking, terrorists doing drug trafficking or terrorists doing human trafficking. News of ISIS doing human trafficking. You can put it in this part to justify this linkage between organized crime and terrorism. So that will just amplify what you are wanting to say. You can talk about FATF and also these are good points. Next, we move on to talking about linkage between organized crime and terrorism at national level. Maoist terror movements, okay. Proximity to Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle. This is also fine. Terrorism against Northeast Kashmir. Okay, so try to explain some of these points. Like just we all question is itself saying that terrorism and organized crime is linked. Basically, they are saying that you can say. And when you are talking about Northeast Kashmir, so this is the main crux of the answer they are expecting. So talk about something, some examples, or you can just explain how terrorism and organized crime is linked in northeastern Kashmir, how human trafficking and how drug trafficking, all of this is done through the porous border areas of India and Myanmar and India and Bangladesh, even in case of India and China. So you can use some examples from there to justify your points. Global efforts to curb organized crime and terrorism. United. Okay, so global efforts again. This is not pretty much needed because they are not asking this. And if you want to write this, just use it in your way forward. No need to mention it separately. Okay, so you have again written way forward also. So I think that is not needed. Then here only you can just mention that strengthening global effort. One point you can just add is strengthening global efforts such as this and this. Here you can mention that strengthening global efforts such as the Convention of United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, Adoption Resolution 2482 by UNSC. You can just give those examples and be done with it. Rest of the way forward, I think it's good. Zero tolerance, UK government's counter strategy, fine strategy of trace, target, and terminate fund. Pursue, protect. Global PM on the occasion of 65th Foundation Day of Directorate stressed on zero data to track. Okay, so in conclusion, again, you need to be a bit crisp here. So what you can do is like when you are writing such statements, no, don't go for saying all of this like Honorable PM on the occasion of this and this, because you are not writing an essay and also these things they will not like appreciate a lot because this makes your conclusion pretty lengthy and they won't even read it, I guess. So what you can do is like cut off this part and just say that start it from here only. Use of latest technology to track, investigate, induct fugitive fugitive economic offenders and organized crime syndicates are the need of the hour. So you can just mention that. Start from here. So first two lines can just be removed from this. Technology, manpower, and intelligence must work together to tackle organized crimes in India. So whenever you read these statements, such statements that Honorable PM has said this, uh, when you are writing JS answer, you can take the liberty to frame that in your own words. No need to say that Honorable PM or Farhan and Flana scholar or some eminent personality has said this thing. You can just use if you think that it is very good and very like crisp, crisply related to what has been asked in the exam or what I need to write. You can just use that, take liberty, and you write his or her views as your own only. You can just conclude that this and this is required and we should be doing this. So that will be good conclusion. It will become crisp and no need to write all of that that PM has said this and that. So overall, I think you have just missed some of the points in this answer, Varsha. You have gone in for writing things that have not been asked specifically. For example, that link difference between organized crime and terrorism was not asked. The UN resolutions were not asked, and then again, way forward, also you have like taken almost one page to write. So this is a lot of space that you are taking, and I don't think 10 marker answer will you will be able to write so much in a 10 marker in the examination paper. So just try to shorten these parts. Focus on what has been asked. So when you are talking about linkages, go for talking about linkages only. Try to make that part multidimensional. There you can show your innovation, give more and more points, think from multiple dimensions, but be, make sure that you stick to that part only. And then there you can use some examples from terrorist organizations, events, what are happening. You can use the name of famous organizations. For example, in this answer, nowhere you have talked about ISIS, Al Qaeda, and all of those organizations. So you can mention those examples that will just enhance your answers and so that you know about organizations, you know about the linkages. So try using that also. FATF example of FATF is fine. So you can do that. And in introduction and this part, I think first part of your answer is pretty good. You have used the diagram quite nicely, and I will say because the question, like this question had this much scope only. Just you can again explain these offenses by mentioning two or three keywords or phrases. That will be good. So overall, I think you will get 4 out of 10 for this answer, Varsha, because especially your knowledge is not an issue in this answer. Just the thing that you have not paid proper attention to what has been asked, but you have just tried to show off your knowledge in this answer. So that will result in reduction of some marks. Next, we move to Nisha's copy. Organized crime is a local, national, or transnational group of centralized organizations and the criminals to carry out illegal. Okay, there are 4 types of organized crime, community, bank robbery, highway crime, racketeering. So these are some petty crimes. Next, we are talking about extortion or otherwise illegal. Perpetrator set up. Okay, ticket crime, highly centralized, smuggling, illegal transport. Okay, so fine, you have mentioned types in a bit different way, Nisha, but try to ensure that you are mentioning almost all of the important criminal offenses that are there. For example, you have talked multiple times about kidnapping and hijacking, etc. For example, you have talked about kidnapping in this part, in the first part, and next you have here also mentioned those examples. Next part, linkages between terrorists and organized crime, international level, organized crime groups. Name helps terrorist organization providing financial, recruiting new members. Okay, through arms and ammunition. Okay, so this is basically the linkage. Fine. So you can just start your answer with this point and then go off for some examples. Organized crime influencing governments such as Pakistan to help the terrorist group survive, led to communal tensions, violence, and international mechanisms existing only in regions of poor governance. And, no, I think you need to mention the examples here. For example, when you're talking about linkages, no. So try to show how terrorists have been using like organized crime to propel their terrorist activities. For that, you have to mention some of the examples. For example, when you are talking about Pakistan, it is fine. You can mention FATF, grey listed Pakistan, and all. So that is one part of example. This is like a state being involved in terrorist activities, but go for talking about some of the important terrorist organizations and how they use organized crime to propel their activities. So some examples from there will be expected in this. And again, you can just divide this part in two parts. For example, first you can talk about international level, then you can go for national level. When you are talking about national level, make sure you are writing something about Northeast India. You are writing something about Jammu and Kashmir. So when you are talking about terrorism at a national level, if you're not mentioning Kashmir even once, I think you must understand that you are not ensuring that you are covering all the dimensions. You are missing some of the parts of the answer. So try to mention those things. Talk about the terrorist organizations active in India and how they fund their activities through organized crime, especially the example of Northeast Jammu and Kashmir, organizations in Jammu and Kashmir, and then talking about Maoists in Central India or Eastern India. So those parts are necessary in this answer. And after that, you can go for talking about two or three way forward. This is fine. The linkages exist only in regions of poor governance and order. The government should introduce high-tech software to track. No, I think this first part is also not very apt because linkages not only occur in regions of poor governance, even if you look at Western countries or areas with proper governance, terrorists are also evolving according to the technology. Like they have started using darknet, cryptocurrency, or various multiple channels in order to strengthen their organization. So this has also been a challenge. Even in countries like New Zealand, you saw that terrorist attack was done on a mosque. So these things keep on happening. So uh, don't go for writing blunt statements like this happens only in regions of poor governance. You can just say that it is a very menacing threat, terrorism, combination of terrorism and organized crime, and we should do such and such thing. For example, use high-tech software, etc., to crack these groups. So that is a futuristic statement. So this statement can be written, and in the first part, just so that it is a very menacing thing, and the need of the hour is to tackle it. So I think you understood this. Second part of your answer, I think, needs a bit of improvement. Otherwise, this answer is pretty fine. First part is decent. In the types of crimes, you can just include more examples, and that will be sufficient. I think overall, I think you will get 3 out of 10 for this answer, Nisha. So that is it for today, guys. I think next we will move towards a new question and a new session on Monday, because tomorrow is Sunday, and I think you can just um, go over the week's activities tomorrow, revise all your answers and all. And on Monday, we will again be posting a question, and then we will meet in the evening session for the evaluation and feedback session. So thank you very much, guys. I hope your answer writing is improving with this initiative, and you are doing well, and also getting motivated to write better answers.